Good evening and welcome to Tysky Sour. On Monday, because it was a bank holiday, we just gave you two stories. Very interesting stories, great guest. But today we have both quality, like we did on Monday, and quantity. We've got 5 stories for you today. A government advisor has resigned over the government's pitiful plans for catch-up education. The story behind the Sky Pool, if you were on social media yesterday, you would have seen this. It has, I suppose there's a dark see-through underbelly to that pool. We've also got Keir Starmer speaking to Piers Morgan and an especially ridiculous outburst from a Blairite in the pages of the Times. That's a very entertaining story. It's our final one, so do make sure you stay tuned for that. I'm joined by Dalia Gebrial. How are you doing, Dalia?
I'm doing good. How are you, Michael?
I'm fine. I'm enjoying the sun. Slight indigestion today. I think there was too much sun, pizza and beer yesterday. I've sort of been suffering slightly, but we're going to get through the show. It'll be fine.
You guys, you're weak when in the face of the sun. I'm like 27 degrees is like my cold, like my kind of like it's temperate. My peak is like 34. That's my ideal temperature.
I'm weak, Dalia. You could have just ended it at the first part of that sentence. If you are not already, do hit the subscribe button. We go live 3 nights a week and we put out videos every day. In March this year, on the first anniversary of Britain's first lockdown, Boris Johnson said that post-pandemic, his biggest priority would be education.
It's been an absolutely unimaginable year for school children, for university students, for everybody in education. They've put up with incredible privations in order to help us, the whole country, get through. And our future as a country depends on us now repaying that generation, making sure they get the education they need. So for me, that's the biggest priority.
So in that same press conference, Boris Johnson celebrated the fact that he had hired Sir Kevan Collins as the government's education recovery czar. He was going to be giving advice on what policies would need to be put into place so that schools could effectively help kids get back into the position they would have been were the lockdown not there. That includes things like English and maths, but also, according to the Czar, it was supposed to include things like music, drama, sports. Now, today, unfortunately for Boris Johnson, and actually unfortunately for the kids of this country, Kevan Collins has decided to resign, and that's in protest because he had advised the government would need to set aside £15 billion towards helping kids catch up after COVID lockdowns. And today, the government has pledged only 1/10 of that. They've promised only £1.4 billion. That's mainly to go towards individual or small group tutoring. Obviously, a tenth of the recommended figure is completely pathetic. Kevan Collins has resigned in protest. In his resignation letter to the Prime Minister, he said, "When we met last week, I told you that I do not believe it will be possible to deliver a successful recovery without significantly greater support than the government has to date indicated it intends to provide. I am concerned that the apparent savings offered by an incremental approach to recovery represent a false economy, as learning losses that are not addressed quickly are likely to compound." Later in the resignation letter, Collins said, "I do not believe it is credible that a successful recovery can be achieved with a programme of support of this size." Now, the story about the resignation, that broke just an hour before we went live, so the government are yet to give any significant response. But Collins' decision does come at the end of a day where ministers have struggled to defend the paltry sum they have put aside for education. On Sky this morning, Gavin Williamson was challenged as to why the package was so much smaller than that suggested by the government's own advisor.
I mean, you appointed Sir Kevan Collins as the catch-up czar. I mean, do you trust him? Do you agree with him?
So we've been working incredibly closely at all stages.
Forgive me. That's a very straightforward question. Do you trust him? Do you believe in what he's trying to achieve? Yes or no?
Absolutely, and these are why the interventions.
He says you need £15 billion. You've given him 1.4 in this, 1.7 earlier on, as you say. but he says you need 15 billion. If you trust him, if you absolutely agree with him, why isn't he getting that money?
So what we've been doing is working with Sir Kevin on a whole package of measures. One of those is the expansion of our tutoring programme. There's £1 billion going into that. The other key element of that expansion and sort of support for schools and children is actually through teacher quality as well. That's why we're committing £400 million to early years and driving up teacher quality, because actually these are interventions that we've worked on together.
If he says, to implement what needs to be implemented, you need £15 billion, why is that money not coming forward? Did you fight for that money? Have you been told you can't have that money? What's going on?
Well, what we're doing is we're building up a whole set of interventions, including the £1.7 billion that's already been committed, complemented by the £1.4 billion. These are all measures that are going to have a direct impact on children. They're going to have a direct impact in terms of actually the amount of tutoring children are going to be able to get. This has far too long been the preserve of those who have been the wealthiest and only been able to afford it. We're making sure that that's expanded so all children are able to benefit. But we recognise there's more work to be done. This is part of a process, and this is why we're launching the review in terms of how we can best support children in terms of their schooling. And one of those elements is about time. Is there extra time that is required for children to be able to be in the classroom, not just for study, but also for enrichment activity as well? And that's what we're undertaking to do.
Now, you will have noticed that however many times you say £1.7 billion is what they put towards recovery education earlier, and £1.4 billion, which is what they've announced today, it does not add up to anywhere near £15 billion. So there's no point in just keep on repeating those numbers as if every time you say them that adds up to a higher figure. It was a really pathetic response there, I thought, from Gavin Williamson, especially, and I don't know if you noticed, the way that in answer to the first question, he sort of brought up teacher quality. Actually, I thought the subtle message there was the problem is teachers. The problem is teachers, which is generally the line we get from this government when they're put under pressure when it comes to, their horrific record when it comes to protecting kids' education. Now, Gavin Williamson there has suggested more money might be in the pipeline, but as Colin's resignation shows, the people close to where decisions are made have very little confidence these investments are going to come forward. I imagine that Colin's hopes that by resigning he will force someone's hand, but we know that this government don't always budge when they're responding to pressure of this sort. You noticed in that interview there that Gavin Williamson was pushed on whether or not he demanded this money, and it was turned down. What we do know from the BBC is that a much bigger and more ambitious plan, which was supposed to cost over £10 billion, was under discussion. That was as recently as last week, but then it got blocked by the Treasury, by Rishi Sunak. We've got a few more quotes from Collins in a moment. First of all, Dalia, what's your initial thoughts on this? It's not really out of step from this government. We've seen them be willing and keen, in fact, to sort of scrap free school meals for students during the holidays over lockdown. Now, after all of this rhetoric about our top priority is going to be recovery for these kids, they're now giving 1/10 of the sum that was recommended by their own advisor.
Yeah, it wasn't that long ago that the Tories and other people in the media were trying to essentially bully school teachers into going into unsafe working conditions on the basis of, think of the children, think of their education, which seems very hypocritical now when you see this absolutely paltry sum of money that has been set aside for children to catch up from the significant disruption that they have faced as a result of this pandemic. But, one of the most effective ways to entrench the class system, both now, but also in the long term and for future generations, is to sort of chip away at the provisions that working class or lower middle class children rely on, whether it's through punishing parents who are struggling to provide a stable life for their children, whether it's punishing the children themselves through things like exclusions or bringing policing into the education system, which is, again, a trend that we're seeing in the government, in this Tory government, or through what we're seeing here, which is basically systematically allowing children to fall through incredibly consequential gaps during times of crisis. And that's, I think, so crucial to the way that this Tory government has operated through systemic neglect and systemic incompetence, like an almost deliberate incompetence. The state doesn't just exercise, power when, or through active violence. You don't just experience state power when you're on the other end of a police truncheon. It's also through being systemically left with nothing in times of crisis. We are in a crisis that has not only financially stretched a lot of people and gutted their savings, but it's created a situation in which there's been a lot of loss, and a lot of that loss has been collective. For example, the loss of access to schools or childcare was, experienced by everyone when schools were shut. But the ability to recuperate from those losses has been left only possible for very wealthy people. And this and the school meals saga both together are perfect examples of this. By choosing to be inadequate, by choosing to be scarce, to withdraw, or to do nothing, the state is actively producing inequality that will last for many generations. And this is part of a much broader story, particularly of this government, which is to reduce and cut any government function that pertains to care or social support, while bolstering and emphasizing the parts of the government that punish and evict and dispossess. And which is why you see sort of this kind of stuff happening alongside things like the policing bill. Boris can easily say, austerity is over, because in many ways, the job of austerity, which is to reduce the state to its purely punitive disciplinary functions, has kind of been achieved. We see the government sort of failing to provide these essential services at times of crisis. So we really need to keep a keen eye on who is going to be stepping in to provide these services where the government has failed. My guess is it will be, big tech, private companies that kind of are very similar to Uber or Deliveroo, which are based on very low labor costs, very low setup costs, highly exploitable labor practices, who hide behind their reputations as, we're just technology companies, we're not employers. You can't hold us responsible for anything that happens as a result of our practices. And allows them to also flout sort of local regulations. I can see those kinds of companies, and we already have seen loads of apps coming in that basically take over these kinds of care functions. I can see them really monopolizing the gaps that are being left by the state at this time, as they seem to offer the only accessible and cheap options for these kinds of services. And there's nowhere else for working class people to turn. So I think it will be that, and a combination of the more kind of typical outsourcing of contracts to companies like those we've seen, like the ones that we saw with the school meals incident over the summer. So to sum up, basically, systemic neglect and inaction is kind of part of a long historical trend of how the Tories have restructured the British state. But we have a lot to be wary of when it comes to what might come next, what might come to replace it.
No, I think you're absolutely right to emphasize how, I suppose, pathetic this is when you compare it to the rhetoric that was being used to get teachers back into classrooms. And particularly the instance of this I remember was the week before Christmas, when we knew that the Kent variant, which is now called the Alpha variant, I think that's a reasonable decision by the WHO to rename them, not with places. For now, I'm going to call it the Kent variant. The Kent variant was already completely out of control in this country. Cases were rocketing. Some schools, such as Greenwich Local Authority, they wanted to shut schools just for an extra week so that people would be able to self-isolate before seeing older relatives. The government sued them. They sued them. They say, missing a week of education is so disastrous that we will force you to stay open, even if, everyone can see it was an incredibly dangerous and stupid thing to do. Now, this government, who claim to care so much about education, they're only willing to stump up 1/10 of the cost that their own advisor recommends is needed to help kids catch up after those lockdowns. I mean, the whole thing's absolutely disgraceful. I want to go back to comments from Kevin Collins, because they are really very damning. And before I read you some quotes from the resignation letter, he also has some quotes in The Times. And the former Education Recovery Commissioner said, The support announced by government so far does not come close to meeting the scale of the challenge and is why I have no option but to resign from my post. The pandemic has affected all pupils but hit disadvantaged children hardest. The package of support announced yesterday falls far short of what is needed. It is too narrow, too small, and will be delivered too slowly. He goes on. It betrays an undervaluation of the importance of education for individuals and as a driver of a more prosperous and healthy society. A half-hearted approach risks failing hundreds of thousands of pupils. So, I mean, he couldn't really be more categorical there in his criticism of the decision that has been made. So the idea, Gavin Williams saying, oh, this is just fine, this is just the first phase of more money that's going to come, it doesn't really wash. Now, the Times had a bit more detail about the circumstances which led to this announcement this morning. They say that Boris Johnson had been shown an outline of Collins' plans, and they said that was for a £15 billion package. As I said, the BBC said over 10 billion, so the Times have got 15 billion, and they say it would have involved 100 hours of extra schooling each year from 2022, and that would have included a focus on art, music and sport, so proper holistic, because I think there will be a battle in government at this period of time where you say the problem is kids are 2 or 3 months behind when it comes to grammar and maths. And actually the argument that needs to be had is that if you're in that very important phase of development and you've been locked in your house for a few months, then it's actually those social aspects that are going to be just as important as maths and English. And Kevin Collins, who was hired as the education czar, seemed like he was very clear about that. And the sense I get is that Rishi Sunak said, no. You know, well, why are we wasting this money on arts and sport? So I should say, yes, the Times also said that whilst Boris Johnson had been shown this and was, willing to let it go ahead, it was vetoed by Rishi Sunak. Of course, this does not mean that Boris Johnson can wash his hands of responsibility. He's the Prime Minister. If Rishi Sunak is making this decision which condemns kids to, well, I don't want to say condemns him to failure, but I mean puts them at a severe disadvantage, then he's the Prime Minister. He can overrule it. Clearly, he hasn't done that in this case. The result is that in the end, the package works out as only £50 per student. And remember, this is a package which is over 3 years. This is incredibly, incredibly paltry. And we can see how that compares to other catch-up funds around the world. So the UK, as you can see here, this is a Guardian graphic. The source is from the Education Policy Institute. They show the UK is so far committing £50 per head per student. That compares to £1,600 per head per student in the United States and £2,500 per head in the Netherlands. Now, they are serious sums, which to me look more appropriate to meeting the kind of intense challenge that the past year faces us with. There were, as we've often said on this show, there were some seriously difficult decisions to be made in government about schools during COVID, and it was inevitable that kids were going to lose out on, a decent amount of education and a decent amount of the kind of socializing that you need to do when you're of that age, or to be honest, that we all need to do, but it's more severe when you're at that phase of development. Those problems were always going to happen. What the government's job is to say, we will do everything in our power to make up for that. That's the rhetoric you heard at the beginning of this segment from Boris Johnson when he was speaking in March, but it's not what their policy looks like. It's not what they've committed to. What's going to happen next is very difficult to say. I hope Marcus Rashford comes out against this, because he seems to be the only person who can force U-turns at this particular period of time. But if nothing changes soon, then this is, I suppose, one of the biggest disgraces I've seen in public policy, since the start of this pandemic, basically, because it's so avoidable. All you have to do is cough up some cash for the future generations who have sacrificed so much, basically to help people who are older than themselves. Young people weren't particularly at risk from this virus. They've missed out on a year so that the older members of our society can be safer. I'm not saying the older people owe them. We as a society owe them, and we're not currently fulfilling that obligation. We're going to go on to our next story. If you're enjoying the stream so far, please do like the video. And I'm going to go to one comment. Tom tweets on the hashtag Tysky. It annoys me that they only have the imagination to say, we'll just stick them in class for longer hours. Perfect opportunity to overhaul a failed education model. When do kids actually get to be kids in school for a full working week? I think that's a super important point. In terms of the longer hours, I mean, I'm not an expert on what's currently being proposed, but as far as I can tell, the extent to which this could be a good thing and what Kevin Collins is proposing is if the extra hours aren't led by teachers who are already overworked enough, or existing teachers who are already overworked enough, and is basically all extracurricular activity. So drama, sports, art. Obviously, after the year they've had, we don't want kids sitting in classrooms for any longer learning maths and grammar. But if what you're offering is extracurricular programs, then potentially kids will be happy to stay for an extra hour. As I say, I'm not an expert on that particular policy question, but it seems to me that there are different ways that extra schooling hours could be approached. Next story. Tim Martin, the owner of pub chain Wetherspoons, has always been one of the most high-profile advocates of Brexit. He was one of the few prominent businessmen in favour of no deal. So not just a Brexiteer, he was a no deal Brexiter. To jog your memory, here he is at a rally for the Brexit Party.
The way they're striping us up is to say, oh yeah, we will honour the referendum result, but we won't go for no deal. Do people think we're stupid? I'm afraid they do. What is called no deal really means free trade. And free trade, no deal, means we save 39 billion quid on day one. When you've got 39 billion quid, that's not a cliff edge, is it?
I suppose the first thing to say is that a completely stupid comment. No deal didn't equal free trade. It equaled trade on WTO terms, which isn't free trade. You still have tariffs and quotas. But in any case, that's not what I want to talk about today, because no deal didn't happen. That's just to show you how hard a Brexiteer he was, and indeed, pretends to still be. And the reason it seems quite the contrast is because now he is saying, oh no, freedom of movement ending has actually caused my pubs some problems, and we need a more liberal immigration system. This is from quotes given to The Telegraph, an article about Tim Martin, suggesting that we should have more liberal immigration controls, similar to the ones we had before the referendum or before Brexit happened. He told the paper, the UK has a low birth rate, a reasonably liberal immigration system controlled by those we have elected, as distinct from the EU system, would be a plus for the economy and the country. America, Australia, and Singapore have benefited for many decades from this approach. Immigration combined with democracy works. Now, you can see there in that quote, he's trying to make this intervention very consistent with him being a Brexiteer. He's saying, let's have more immigration, but let's just decide it democratically instead of having free movement. Obviously, you can argue that we consented to take part in free movement. So on one level, it was democratic, but we'll put that to one side again. Important to remember is that this intervention comes as industry bosses warn that pubs and restaurants are suffering from labour shortages. So they're having to shut during lunchtime shifts due to shortages of workers. So quoted in the same Telegraph piece was the chief executive of TGI Friday, speaking about this issue. He's called Robin Cook, and he said, it's a perfect storm. There's the arduous process of hiring from the EU and the change of statuses around the new visa process, which is more cumbersome and less user-friendly. Other people are not moving back here because of the situation with COVID. If you look at that quote in isolation from Tim Martin, he's saying, no, this has got nothing to do with the hard Brexit I wanted. I wanted to have Brexit and a really liberal immigration system, but just one that the British government controlled. Now, I mean, if you look at the rhetoric of the campaign and the government we've ended up with, that was never going to happen. The government read Theresa May, Boris Johnson, all of them read Brexit as a sign that we should have a more restrictive immigration system. That's why we got Priti Patel as Home Secretary. So this idea that you can have your cake and eat it. So no, I want Brexit and loads of immigration is already a bit ridiculous. But to me, this reads as someone who campaigned for a policy which would limit immigration and is now a bit pissed off he has to pay higher wages to get people to come and work for him. Is that your interpretation as well?
I mean, this was an entirely predictable outcome. We always knew that low wage but very essential labor in the UK has been carried out by migrants for many decades now. It's the work that basically citizens don't want to do, work that is punishing, it's difficult, it's poorly waged, poorly conditioned, poorly regulated. It often happens at unsocial hours. And eliminating freedom of movement was always going to hit those industries because freedom of movement specifically from the EU was always going to hit those industries because they rely on that labor force to function. And we have swathes of data, endless amounts of data that demonstrate that even when companies or these industries specifically seek out UK-born and particularly UK-born white workers, they struggle to fill those gaps. So the absence of migrant workers was never going to actually result in these workforces being taken over by citizens. But I think it's very important that we kind of don't celebrate this moment as some kind of, funny or fun gotcha moment for the Tim Martins of the world. Because whilst, of course, the post-Brexit experience for migrants, especially for EU migrants, is set to be extremely brutal, we shouldn't glamorize, I think, the immigration system that we had when we were in the EU, because that immigration system was in many ways centered around providing countries like the UK, and particularly cities like London, with a highly exploitable workforce, a workforce that doesn't have to be treated with dignity and doesn't have to be treated particularly well. We often passingly said, and particularly during the referendum, we passingly said that companies like Wetherspoons hire migrant labor because migrant labor is cheaper, as if that's just like a given or an inherent feature of migrant labor. But human beings aren't born more or less cheap than other human beings, right? Like, they are made cheaper through a variety of very violent social and economic forces that mean that certain groups of people are forced to work much harder for less money than others. And those forces are things like racism, the immigration systems, colonialism, and inequity between countries. And so I think there was always that kind of problem with the pro-Remain, sort of more liberal pro-Remain campaigns that celebrated that kind of work ethic and contribution of migrant workers to the UK without being aware of the sort of profound brutality and the exploitation that produces that very migrant work ethic. That migrant work ethic is essentially a symptom of the fact that some people are pushed to accept really shit working conditions because they're seen as less valuable as human beings and they have fewer options. But what I think we're going to see now with this kind of particular configuration, this call for an Australia-style system of immigration, is essentially an intensification of those practices of creating exploitable workforces through an immigration system. I don't actually think we will see significantly less immigration. I think there will be certain recruitment drives to encourage labour-based immigration to the UK because of those reasons of why immigration is so essential to the particular economic model we have. But what we're going to see is immigration turned into a much more brutal and precarious experience where the rights of migrants are exclusively tied to your employment, which means that your employer holds far much more power over you, where things like unionizing and political participation become very difficult, where migrants are being subject to more surveillance and more policing. So in a sense, I think that the post-Brexit approach to immigration is likely to not be a massive diversion from what we had before. I think we'll actually end up seeing similar because of, the need to compensate for these losses in the labour market, similar levels of immigration, but immigration and movement on the terms of the British state and on the terms of British capital, and therefore an intensification of the most exploitative parts of the immigration system that was already in place.
How very depressing. So you're saying the post-Brexit immigration system might be quite similar to the one that went before, but it's just going to give people like Tim Martin more power.
Exactly.
The last thing I want is for that idiot to have more power.
Exactly. And more power over the lives of the workforce, their workers, which mean that those workers are going to be which means that wages are going to fall even lower, working conditions are going to fall even lower, and the difference in wages and conditions between migrant workers and citizen workers is going to be much bigger, which will again make conditions for everyone worse overall. So a little bit of a little nugget of optimism there for you all.
Yeah. Well, you've got to tell it like it is, even if it's not a a cheerful truth for us all to dwell on. If you're enjoying the show, if you enjoy lots of our shows, then now would be a great time to become a Novara Media supporter. We do ask people to, if they can, donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Lots of you do already. We massively appreciate that. That's why Novara Media has been able to expand so much over the past 2 years, and we want to continue doing the same. If you aren't already, do go to novaramedia.com/support. After a miserable May, the UK is finally basking in a few days of sunshine. And for the TV networks, that means cameramen have been called on to film people frolicking in parks, beaches, and swimming pools. This clip on the BBC has got a lot of attention.
This sky pool, doesn't it look amazing, is near the US Embassy in Nine Elms, just south of the River Thames. And it's believed to be the world's first transparent pool built between 2 skyscrapers. So I think you'd need to have a head for heights, wouldn't you? You wouldn't want to be swimming along there and looking down to the ground below. But it looks really spectacular, the water there glistening in the sunshine. Swimmers able there to enjoy views of Parliament and the London Eye while they swim their lengths of the 25-metre pool. One catch, though, is you have to be a resident to use it.
Now, that clip has been viewed 14 million times. That's because lots of people have been sharing it on Twitter. Lots of them to say, it's pretty cool to have this suspended pool in the sky. More than that, people saying, I'd be terrified to go in that. But you also see, if you scroll through Twitter, that there are thousands of people who are, I suppose, shocked by the gross inequity of housing in this city, that you see people, it's so extravagant. People swimming on a hot day in this pool suspended between 2 tower blocks. Now, I want to go through a few of the comments, which I think show the sorts of things people were saying in response to this. So one Twitter user said, "You're telling me the combined genius of property developers and architects have worked out how to make this, but they can't work out how to take cladding off high-rise blocks where working class families live down the road." That's obviously a reference to Grenfell, and also the fact that now we know how dangerous that flammable cladding that was around Grenfell is. It still sits up on so many high-rise buildings in this country. We live in a society where we can build an infinity pool connecting 2 towers, but we can't change flammable cladding after 4 years. So 4 years after it caused an incredible, deadly disaster that killed over 70 people. Go to another tweet juxtaposed the so-called sky pool next to images of the appalling conditions council tenants in Croydon have been living in. So this is in one Croydon tower block. And you can see here the level of mold, in fact, on a building that people had to live in during the lockdown. Now, we actually did a segment on this because it was so appalling. And again, obviously, some of the most interesting responses, though, were about the building in particular. So about this specific building with the sky pool, and particularly a potential inaccuracy in what the BBC anchor said in their voiceover. Because what you heard there in that voiceover was that, unfortunately, only residents can swim in this infinity pool. But it's actually much worse than that, because it's only some residents who are allowed to swim in that infinity pool. That's because the building which it's part of, it's a development which grew around the new American embassy in Vauxhall. So a super luxury development, loads of money went into it, loads of investment, loads of high-rise flats which are selling for, for millions and millions of pounds. They have 2 types of tenant. Those who purchased the flats at extortionate market rates and those who bought them through a so-called affordable shared ownership scheme. Now, only those tenants who paid full price get to use the infinity pool. The background is explained in a Guardian long read by Oliver Wainwright. So you can see here, Wainwright spoke to a tenant, the building you saw in that sky clip. So he spoke to someone who lives in that building, but who is not able to access that pool. So the tenant said, "We have a front row seat of the sky pool, but the sad thing for us living in the shared ownership building is that we will never have access to it. It's only there for us to look at, just like the nice lobby and all of the other facilities for the resident of the pool blocks. Nobody expects these amenities for free, but we're not even given the choice to pay for them." Wainwright goes on to write, "For Iqbal to reach his two-bed flat valued at £800,000, of which he owns a quarter and pays rent on the rest, he must walk past the grand hotel-style main entrance to the complex, flanked by supercars with personalised number plates, to the back of the development, past construction fences and piles of rubble, to a small door located between ventilation grills and a bin store facing onto a railway line. There's a reason they're called poor doors," he said. "I grew up in South Africa in a country that was racially segregated, but in London there is still really bad class segregation. We have a mortgage and we pay our rent, but every day we are made to feel inferior, like the have-nots of 9 Elms." Really, really shocking to listen to that. You're seeing this clip, lots of people sharing it because it is it's kind of incredible architectural feat, but there are people living in the same building who just have to watch people swim in that. They're not allowed to go into it themselves. It's not the only problem with that development, as you can guess. That's partly one of the big problems, is the developers managed to whittle down the proportion of affordable homes in the blocks. So the blocks are in Lambeth and Wandsworth, the development shared between those two boroughs. And they have a target of 33 to 40% affordable new homes in any new block. However, in this case, the developers managed to reduce that to only 15% in exchange for investment in a new tube station. Now, obviously, the tube station is useful to some people that live there, but also what it does is increase the value of those very same developments. So basically, they said, no, we're not going to put affordable houses in. What we're going to do is pay for a tube station, which is actually going to just increase the value of our property. It's all criminal. And for Aiden Dickadem, a Labour councillor in the ward that includes the development, it was all a big missed opportunity.
This was an amazing opportunity to transform the kind of Riverside and build the kind of houses that London needs. The kind of decisions that were made by politicians have kind of tied 9 Elms to a model of regeneration that fundamentally reduces the public good on this land. That was, we're not going to have an opportunity like that again. And I think it's criminal what's happened.
So Wandsworth is a Tory-controlled council. So unfortunately, Aiden is in the opposition. In a thread written by Aiden, in response to that Sky Pool clip, he compared the 9 Elms development unfavourably with Churchill Gardens just across the river in Pimlico. Now, that development was built by Westminster Council between 1946 and 1962 and includes 1,600 homes, which were nearly all for social rent. Now, obviously, the right to buy has changed on that. I think you can see an image of Churchill Gardens now. So more of them will be privately owned at this point in time. But what this shows is that it's not inevitable that in central London properties, you're only going to have the super rich and then 10% of people going through poor doors. We have been able to, in this country, build high quality social housing, which people on ordinary incomes can live in. This was actually also by a Conservative government. You can see how much times have changed. Westminster was controlled by the Conservatives then, as it is now. But now, when we have any parts of real estate that need to be redeveloped, you have councils. In this case, they're a Tory council, but you often have Labour councillors who do the same, who hand over that space to private developers who make it all for often, just assets, speculative assets for foreign investors, and serves absolutely no purpose whatsoever for the community. Now, Dalia, I want to bring you in on this. And I mean, the thing this really makes me think is that, many social and political changes have positives and negatives. When you think of how policy is different now to the 60s, you say, oh, there are some downsides, there are some upsides. When it comes to selling off social housing and giving all control of our public spaces to international property developers, there are only downsides as far as I can see. It does seem to me just like complete vandalism.
Yeah, this story has to be understood within that broader shift that you outline, that shift of, that wider context of gentrification and housing policy, especially as it has developed over the past few decades. Actually, there was a report recently released by Runnymede and Class, which is a really good report on gentrification in London. It's authored by Adam Almeida, and the report actually maps how gentrification operates as a form of essentially social and racial cleansing. It develops this gentrification index, which measures things like, population movement or churn. So how many people are moving into and out of a borough, how that maps onto kind of demographic changes, house prices, other indices of deprivation. And I actually found that Wandsworth was one of the 3 most gentrified boroughs in London between the years 2010 and 2016. So it's no surprise that this particularly ghastly example of the unequal experience of London, depending on your class, but also, and in a way that is articulated through race, Wandsworth and these, Lambeth, these kinds of areas are very multiracial, and historically Black and brown communities. That's not really reflected in the people that we saw swimming in that pool, but, I will refrain from comment. But it's not a surprise that we see that specifically in Wandsworth because of that broader context. And I think that reference to this being a form of social apartheid, it's a very powerful formulation, but I think it's absolutely correct. And it's the fact that you can have a city that has so many resources, cultural resource, social, economic, political resources in a city. And yet those resources are experienced so unevenly according to your race, your class, your migration status. That doesn't happen by accident. That's urban design. That has roots in how the system of London and the systems in London are designed. And I would encourage everyone to check out that report because it has some really great analysis, but also some actual policy recommendations on what we do about this, ranging from things like rent controls to the right to return for residents who are living in estates or have been living in estates that are undergoing these regeneration schemes. But I think that, especially this example, it just goes to show how London is just this deeply, and most global cities actually are these deeply contradictory cities. We've got so many empty properties, and yet the number of homeless people, the number of people who are rough sleepers has massively expanded. The fact that we can make this infinity pool between 2 sort of tower blocks, and yet we can't organize to remove the cladding from all these other tower blocks. That means that thousands of people are living in essentially a fire trap. It's Dickensian, and it needs and I think that the reason that contradiction is because we know that cities like London, for reasons that we mentioned in the previous story, they require a racially and socioeconomically diverse population, because you need different people to fulfill these, who have different levels of power to fill these different labor forces. But the city has to be designed in a way that if we're going to have class and race diversity, we need to make sure that class and race divisions are still in place. And I think that's also why, a lot of the discourse surrounding London falls so short, and it gets a lot of pushback, especially from, working class people who have been raised in London and have watched the city change for the worse in this way. Yes, it's true that so much of the UK's and indeed the world's financial and social and cultural and political and all of that kind of resource is located in London. But so many Londoners are, in a myriad of ways, bureaucratic, social, all of these different minor ways that add up to a big cost, are excluded from those resources. Not only are they excluded from certain resources, but they actually are systemically subjected to forms of harm that are quite particular to London and other global cities, whether it's things like, excessive policing, police brutality, actively dangerous housing, poor local environment. And so I think that conversation about regional inequality and how that relates to other forms of inequality, it's actually much more nuanced and complicated than we have been led to believe. And I think it's important that we can come up with political languages that accurately encompass and reflect those conditions, rather than try and dichotomize the issue at hand in a way that actually doesn't create effective political bonds between people who live in different parts of the country but are experiencing similar forms of dispossession.
All incredibly important points. We could talk about this for hours, but we've got two more stories to get through. Thanks to the grillings he's given government ministers on Good Morning Britain, Piers Morgan is considered to be one of the toughest political interviewers in Britain. So when Keir Starmer announced he'd be granting the pundit a one-on-one primetime interview, many eyebrows were raised. However, on ITV's Life Stories, what many saw as a gamble appears to have paid off, and the Labour leader was widely praised for showing his human side, including the moment he opened up about the death of his mother.
You spent a lot of time with her when she had to go and have treatment and stay in, and day after day, weeks after weeks sometimes. You were young when this was going on.
My mum got Still's disease. It's a disease that attacks your joints. For some people, it comes and goes. For Mum, it came and it came and it came again. My dad was totally devoted to her. And I remember being at home and he phoned and he said, "Your mum's not going to make it. Can you tell the others?" And that hit me.
Was it cruel of your father to make you do that? To do it that way?
No. He wasn't going to leave her side. There's no way he was coming out of that hospital, even to tell his own kids. He was going to stay there with her. He always did. At her side, in the high dependency unit. And if he couldn't be there, he'd sleep on the chairs outside. There was no way he was coming home. He wouldn't leave her. This was the same every time she was in hospital. He wouldn't leave her side. But when she died, it broke him.
He never recovered, did he?
He lived, but he didn't recover.
Now, that was a very, very moving clip, and I watched the whole thing. Keir Starmer does come across very well. He comes across as someone with, a degree of emotional intelligence, and there is a contrast between him and Boris Johnson. I think if Boris Johnson was in a similar situation, actually, in fact, I have no idea how it would go. Because, it is worth saying, people said this was a risk. I'd never actually watched Live Stories before. It turns out it is the most softball show I've probably ever seen. If you hadn't watched it, it's sort of basically lots of clips of people who really like Keir Starmer, so his friends and his allies in the party saying really nice things about him, and then Piers Morgan asks him a softball question and he gives an answer. Now, that's not to say, it was a good idea he did this, evidently. He also, as I say, comes across well, especially talking about things like his parents. Obviously, what his advisors are hoping is that this will turn around public opinion about him and about his leadership of the Labour Party. Dalia, I want to know from you, will things like this make any difference?
Obviously, I feel huge sympathy for anyone that experiences the loss of a loved one, and especially in those kind of circumstances. It's incredibly tough, and it's hard not, it's difficult to listen to, and it's hard not to feel sympathetic. But I think the problem is that this isn't, and I guess it's not intended to be that anyway, but it's not a useful interview for really understanding what the Labour Party under Keir Starmer would do if it had power, or for people, who are concerned with what the choices of who will form, a government in the future are going to be. And I understand that there is a need to kind of elicit a sense of personal connection to a leader, but that's not, that it can't cover for a lack of substance. We still don't have a path to power. We still don't have a convincing and achievable and ambitious program that matches the crisis that we face, matches the scale of the crisis that we face. And I think that the kind of quite gushing response of the political and media class is kind of indicative of how little these kind of classes actually view what politics is, and how the idea that they think that by kind of cultivating the personal side of Keir Starmer, that can somehow compensate for lack of vision. It's kind of that logic that underpins that sort of politics by focus groups, which is this idea that you can kind of just trick people into feeling affinity with a party or a leader and make them vote for you, even if you're not giving them concrete things to vote for. And it's also, I'll just end on this, but the the reputation of Keir Starmer as being sort of cold or detached, it's not because we haven't heard enough about his personal life. It's because he's treated his party members with quite a lot of contempt. He's suspended a former leader that was incredibly popular amongst members, and he doesn't seem to have any kind of personal conviction or drive, and rather he just kind of follows wherever he thinks the wind is going. So that's where that sense that Keir Starmer comes off as kind of distant and detached comes from. And I'm sure that, this does count as, in the context of recent media appearances for the Labour Party, is up there with one of the better ones. But I don't think that's saying much. And I don't think it compensates for what went down in those previous interviews when it comes to, front benchers being asked, what does the Labour Party stand for, and being told that it's confidential.
No, I mean, it's hard to disagree with anything you've said there. I mean, that was all incredibly fair, especially about... Let's go to one of the most over-the-top gushing responses to this interview, actually. As I said, the interview was quite dignified. Some of the responses potentially less so. This was Chris Bryant. He's obviously a Keir Starmer fan. He's a Labour MP. He tweeted, "A lot of us have always known that Keir Starmer was a decent, honest man, full of the milk of human kindness and passion for life and justice." Goes on. Every interview he has done recently, including Matt Ford and Life Stories, goes to prove the UK would be safer in his hands. Does it prove that? I'm not sure. It proves he's got some emotions. The milk of human kindness. I haven't heard that one before. An interesting phrase to say about your leader. Maybe he's looking for a promotion. In terms of whether this will change things, we should remember the interview. It's a primetime slot. It's watched by 1.6 million people. Not an insignificant number of people, but as Dalia says, this is telling us he's not a psychopath. It's not necessarily telling he's got an amazing vision for the country. 1.6 million people. Will it have changed their mind? It's still only 1.6 million people. It compares to, for an idea of how many people watch TV at any one time, 3.7 million people watched Coronation Street, which aired immediately before. You might say a slightly unfair comparison. That's one of ITV's most successful shows. So let's compare it with previous episodes of Life Stories. That's Piers Morgan's interview show. Captain Tom's interview got 2.9 million. Gemma Collins got 2.6 million viewers in February. So I suppose, more people were potentially staying inside. That was a lockdown. Hard to compare these things. Basically, the interview went well. It is not going to be a game changer. The guy needs some policies as well as an ability to, probably quite genuinely make it seem like he's, a decent family man. Let's go on to our final story, which is related to Keir Starmer. Let's get straight into it. A new poll shows that a majority of voters think Keir Starmer should resign as Labour leader. You can see the figures here. The poll is from Redfield and Winton. Among all voters, 37 people think he should stand down now. 28% of people don't. Now, you might say that doesn't mean much when it's Tory voters anyway, but it's the Labour voters that I think matter here. 40% of Labour voters who voted Labour in 2019 want him to stand down. 35% of people want him to stay in the job. You can see that the only group of voters who want him to remain Labour leader are Lib Dems. Unfortunately for Keir Starmer, there weren't very many of them in 2019. We can go to the question slightly different. Should he be replaced before the next election? So before the 2024 election. This one is quite significant, I think. So here, let's just focus on Labour voters. 49% of Labour voters want him to stand down before 2024. Only 16% of people oppose that happening. So it's a very small amount of people who are committed to Keir Starmer standing to be the next Labour Prime Minister. Now, alongside the disastrous results in Hartlepool, it's polls like these that might explain why the party's Blairites are getting ever more desperate to purge the left. Why? How does the logic work? Because if Keir Starmer has to resign, he'll clearly be replaced by someone else. That goes without saying. And they don't want that to be a left-winger. They don't want left-wing members to be able to vote for that left-winger. They basically want to destroy the power of the left in the party so that if Keir Starmer falls, another right-winger will replace him. And I think this is the context in which we should read one particularly deranged op-ed, which was published by the political director of the Tony Blair Institute in The Times. So it's titled, "Labour Must Encourage Open Debate or It Will Die." Now, from that title alone, I wouldn't have guessed this was calling for a massive purge of the left in the Labour Party. Debate, purges don't normally go together. However, this is a particularly incoherent article by Ryan Wayne, as I said, political director of the Tony Blair Institute. And after blaming the left for Labour's loss in Hartlepool, which was a seat obviously held under Corbyn, the author writes of the left that wrapped up in identity politics, their views become incontestable. Arguing against them is a political minefield of terminology where it's very easy to get blown up by the wrong word. The consequences can be fatal. We end up with a so-called progressive party unable to tolerate different points of view, a party where preaching has replaced debate. Whether it's the endless propagating of an anti-Western worldview, fighting over the rights of biological women to have safe spaces, or tweeting a picture of the Ku Klux Klan alongside the Sewell report, Labour's backseat drivers are drowning out moderate voices. A lot to say about this. So first of all, Labour did not lose Hartlepool because of trans rights. They probably lost it because of Brexit. Also, what's obviously ridiculous about this is to suggest that Keir Starmer is drowned out by people on the left talking about issues he's not necessarily campaigning on. The people who get airtime on the radio and on television, and the news bulletin, most importantly, that's not left-wing backbenchers. That's Keir Starmer and his ministers. What this writer is talking about is Twitter, right? He's saying there are lots of backbenchers who say things on Twitter which Keir Starmer doesn't agree with. That's not how votes are won or lost. Clearly, though, this guy is looking for someone to blame. He goes on, the regressive left just doesn't get it. Their prescription following the Hartlepool defeat involves resurrecting the spirit of Corbynism and further entrenchment in the retweet-inducing, self-affirming world of identity politics. There is only one solution if Labour want to win. This wing of the party must be removed from the front line. No ifs, no buts. Firing Rebecca Long-Bailey and removing the whip from Jeremy Corbyn saw a bounce in the polls, but this isn't just a popular thing to do, it's the right thing to do. Labour must be about much more than internal battles and self-serving, introspective cultural issues. It should be prepared to debate. Again, lots of things to say about this particular passage. So first of all, the idea of this poll bounce doesn't really stack up. So obviously, Jeremy Corbyn was suspended from the whip in November. Labour were doing reasonably well in the polls that winter, but that was more because of the death toll, which was piling up because of the Tories' catastrophic handling of coronavirus. Now, if you don't believe me, let's abstract Labour's polling from Tory performance and just look at how people were thinking about Keir Starmer, whether or not he was performing well or badly in his job. It was when the whip was withdrawn from Jeremy Corbyn that Keir Starmer's ratings really start to plummet. So in fact, it was that decision which I think we can probably infer really damaged Keir Starmer in the polls, far from pleasing the electorate. However, of course, we don't really need to bother with polling to see how stupid this argument was. The author starts a paragraph saying the left have to be purged, and then he ends up saying we have to be prepared to debate. The two are not consistent. They are not compatible with one another. If you want to have a party where you have open debate and say, look, Keir Starmer is the leader, he sets the direction of the Labour Party, but we're not scared of having people like Jeremy Corbyn or Rebecca Long-Bailey or John McDonnell disagreeing with us because we're an open party. We have the confidence in our ideas as Keir Starmer and the leadership that we can, have a grown-up debate. No, this guy is saying you've got to kick them all out. That's the opposite of a debate. A little bit more from this article. He goes on to say, this is a key tenet of progressive politics, an ability to hear different perspectives, build on them, and reach a new unifying position rather than just sitting on the fence. And his main argument is the left must be purged. Labour's leadership must act quickly and decisively, taking a stand against the regressive left. If they can't debate, disagree, but fall into line, they must leave. It will be painful. Twitter will be an unedifying spectacle and fissures will likely be permanent. Dalia, I want to bring you in on this ridiculous article. I mean, for a start, he's kind of talking about democratic centralism. So it's sort of a bit of a Stalinist principle in a way. It's probably some good arguments for it, but it's not an argument that he seems to want to make. He's saying you have an internal debate and the argument is won. And then if the argument is won, not in your favor, you all shut up. Every single person in the party has to spout the party line. Even on Twitter, you can't say something which the leadership haven't approved. That's a really, really centralizing idea. Very, very disciplinarian, very Stalinist, yet he seems to think this is, consistent with saying the Labour Party needs to be open. What do you think is going on here? What's going through this guy's mind?
Works at the Tony Blair Institute, right? Is that correct?
He's political director at the Tony Blair Institute, so I presume he had Tony Blair's blessing to write this piece.
So, I mean, it's his job to come up with an argument to fit the line, right? So by hook or by crook, no matter how incoherent, he needed to find a way of looking at what's happening right now in the Labour Party and using it as an excuse to purge the left. But look, the notion that the left is making Labour into a party that cannot tolerate disagreement and is dishing out fatal consequences to those who divert from a particular line is so delusional, especially in the context of the Labour Party. Jeremy Corbyn and Corbynism itself actively courted, some would say too much, and tried to include people from across the different traditions in the Labour Party. There were many people in his various cabinets that did not come from, the Corbynite or the McDonnell tradition. And it was they who tried to destroy him, not the other way around. If you think about this idea of, we have discussions within the party, and even if you disagree with the outcome, you take it on board. Sorry, is that not what Jeremy Corbyn did with nuclear? Nuclear disarmament. Jeremy Corbyn's, one of his most passionate positions is for nuclear disarmament, is for ending Trident. And, but when there was a debate within the party and party members, I think it was party members, maybe it was the PLP, said, no, we want to be in favor of Trident. He said, okay, it's not my position, but it's the party democracy, and I have to respect that. The position on the EU referendum, Jeremy Corbyn's not massively pro-Remain. He's historically a Eurosceptic, but that was the party position. That was the way that the members voted. He did that. That's what he respected. And it wasn't Corbyn that purged swathes of the party membership who were seen to divert from, the position of the Labour Party establishment at the time. And it was Keir Starmer who, let's not forget, suspended Jeremy Corbyn and sacked Rebecca Long-Bailey because of a tweet. So who here is actually punishing diversity of thought? Who here is intolerant of other views and is dishing out fatal consequences for those who depart from the party line or depart from, even just the establishment line within the party? And also, who here is invested in identity politics and, cultural issues, as if cultural issues are not, part of what a political party should be invested in? But is it the people who are fighting for, better infrastructure, for universal access to services? Or is it those who spend every waking moment frothing at the mouth about, metropolitan North London elites with their, cappuccinos, while providing no concrete policies and no concrete program whatsoever, but just trafficking off this kind of very superficial lines of division that they're trying to outline? So this kind of story that is being told here, it's not grounded in reality, but unfortunately, this kind of flipping of the reality, this direct inversion where people who are incredibly tolerant are being portrayed as deeply intolerant, and people who are deeply intolerant are positioning themselves as bastions of tolerance. It actually is seeming to cut through a little bit. And so I think the left needs to be far more confident in sort of pointing out this hypocrisy and this projection, and not acting shy when accused of things that are clearly not true.
I mean, a very effective rebuttal. It's a shame you can't get that published in the Times. Let's focus on who this guy is a little more, because I presume, we can get something published in the Times. Connected guy, political director at the Tony Blair Institute. I presume, well, I mean, you can basically assume, right, that he had Tony Blair's blessing to write this. We know Keir Starmer is fairly close to people around Tony Blair. Peter Mandelson, for example. Another thing we know about this guy, and this is thanks to Solomon Hughes, who's an investigative journalist, is that he formally launched a third party. And no, it wasn't even Change UK, because Change UK, compared to the party this guy started, was a roaring success. He started the new centrist party called United for Change. I think we can bring up Solomon Hughes' tweets here, so you can see that I think this is from his LinkedIn, where it's showing that he was the CEO and co-founder of United for Change. This was less successful than Change UK, because while they got obliterated in a general election, this party never got to the point of standing in a general election. They got funding from billionaires, but they couldn't even get, a single representative elected or even standing anywhere. This guy's a complete failure. And now he's saying what Keir Starmer needs to do is not have any policies. There wasn't a single policy mentioned in that article. He just needs to purge the left and hope for the best. It's completely... Let's end tonight's show there. Dalia, it's been an absolute pleasure being joined by you on this Wednesday evening.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be back.
Thank you, as ever, for watching Tysky Sour. If you haven't already, give the video a like. We'll be back on Friday at 7 p.m. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.